Well, it is good to see everybody tonight. Hope everyone's having a good week. Tonight we're going to start with qualification number 10. If you want to go ahead and be turning to that in your handout, qualification number 10. Before we get started, I have been asked if we would have a special prayer tonight. Be sure and mention Sister Georgia Pierce. Sister Georgia, as we know, has not been doing very well for quite some time. She is under hospice care, and they have had to increase her medications because she's starting to have a lot of agitation and things that so often go along with some of the medications and the condition that she has. And the hospice nurse came by today, increased her dosages, and said that she is really weak. She's really not doing well at all. And so whenever we have our prayer this evening, let's remember Sister Georgia and all of her family in our prayers. David, would you lead us in that prayer tonight?
Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day you blessed us with. We're thankful for the beauty of this time of the season. We're thankful, Father, for the opportunity to be here this evening with our brothers and sisters. And we pray, Father, that we'll gain from our time here tonight. Father, we're thankful for our health, the things that we have enjoyed. Help us to never take that for granted. With that in mind, Father, we pray for those who need our prayers here. We continue to pray for Richard Greenguard. We continue to pray for Barb Grimsby and her back situation, Father, and many others. We're thankful, Father, for all the ways that you bless us, Father. And we take time now to ask a special blessing for our sister Georgia Pierce. And we know she's having a difficult time, Father. We pray that her last days on this earth will be peaceful, and we pray that her health can be restored. If that's not in your will, Father, we pray that she might have ease of pain and be able to have a peaceful passing through this life, Father, and enter into heaven. Help us, Father, to love each other more and encourage each other more and be patient and forgiving and long-suffering with each other. Help us to let that light of Jesus shine in our lives each day. Be with our country as we elect a new leader, and help us to be a country that moves back closer to thee and make peace abound throughout the world. Bless us, Father, in our lives, and may we live to your glory and honor. And above all, we thank you for our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray, Father.
Amen. Well, tonight, as I said, we're going to start with the 10th qualification that you see there on the paper that I handed out to you. And that is that an elder must not be violent. The King James Version says not a striker. Well, this refers to one who fights with others, who bullies others, who uses physical strength and manipulation in order to force his ways and his opinions on others. And so what this is telling us is that an elder should be the type of man who does not allow his temper to push him to become physically violent in his relationships with other people. And what we're going to find, at least by my estimation, 10 and 11, these qualifications really go hand in hand with each other. Because 10 starts out telling us something that an elder should not be, and then 11 gives us kind of the opposite of that, showing us what an elder should be. But ultimately, what this is showing us, initially when it talks about that a man must not be violent, it goes hand in hand with something that we've talked about in some of these other qualifications, that an elder should be someone who is self-controlled. A man who is able to control the extremes of his emotions. That does not mean that an elder can never get angry. It does not mean that an elder is never going to get upset. It does not mean that an elder will never have to get strong and pointed in the conversations that he has, especially with those who are in error or in defending the truth. But ultimately, this specific qualification, it's talking about the fact that an elder is going to be a man who will not resort to physical violence. He is not going to lash out in anger. I know of one congregation, a congregation that I used to serve here in Northeast Arkansas, who a couple of years before I went there, the eldership dissolved because the two elders who were serving got in a knockdown, drag-out fist fight in the church office. And of course, it was over a scriptural issue. It was over disagreements over marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And one of them was much more hot-tempered than the other, and the one that was very hot-tempered really attacked the other elder, and the other elder had to resort to defending himself, and it really was a bad situation. It was something that never should have got to that point. Now, I really don't think we have to worry about that with David and Tom. I don't think that that's something that that would ever transpire. But what this is coming back to, it's once again pointing to these attributes of an elder's character. They should never have to resort or feel like they have to resort to violence. And much of this also goes hand in hand, like I said, with being able to control their emotions. Being able to, as Jesus said, be angry and sin not. You know, I'm sure that there are times, and if we were to ask David and Tom, I'm sure there have been times that there's been frustrations, where there's been disappointments, where there's been even periods of anger to various degrees. But you have to know how to navigate that. You have to know how to control and keep that in check. And that's what brings us to number 11. And as I said, I think these really go hand in hand. On one hand, showing what an elder is not to be, but then going to what an elder should be. An elder must be gentle. And as I said, the best way that I see of looking at this is saying, instead of resorting to physical violence, an elder should be gentle in his relations with others. Now, Paul uses this word to describe the gentle nature that every servant of the Lord should have. Each and every Christian should have a kind and gentle nature about them. We find an example of this in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24. But we find that in this as well, an elder, in looking at this concept of being gentle, we see that it applies to the concept of gentleness, but hand in hand with that is kindness and moderation. Kindness and moderation. And what this is emphasizing for us here is once again this concept of self-control. Now, going back to what I mentioned when we were talking about not a striker or is not violent, this does not mean that there will never be a time when an elder has to be stern. This does not mean that there will never be a time when an elder has to take a very strong stand. And I think that understanding this concept of moderation, knowing how far to push that before it becomes unkind and ungentle, there's a great degree of wisdom that must come into play there. Because we understand that when it comes to the truth of the gospel, we cannot be wavering on that. We have to stand firm in our convictions, stand firm in what the gospel says. And so there may be times, not just elders, but anyone in the Lord's church has to take a strong stand. But that's where we have to stop and consider the concept of speaking the truth in love. Making sure that the way that we are presenting the truth, even though we're taking a strong stand saying that we're not going to deviate from the truth, but we make sure that we let people know that the reason that we are confronting that in the way that we are is because the love that we have for the souls of the lost. We don't want them to fall prey to those sinful situations. And so we take that strong stand for the truth. And that's where, as I have here, speaking the truth in love is so important. And whenever we consider this concept of gentleness, that's where we see this going hand in hand. Any questions or comments on 10 and 11? Yes, sir.
I think part of the reason why speaking the truth in love is so important is because people, when you know, regardless whether it's true or not, you will push people away. You say the most truth thing ever, yell at someone's face, they're not going to just pass you off.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you go to someone and the first thing that you do is make them angry or hurt their feelings or condemn them, one of the things that I always try to do, if you go back and you read the writings of Paul, so many times he had to approach very, very bad situations in some of those congregations. As well, you look at Revelation 2 and 3 with the letters to the 7 churches of Asia. There were several of those congregations that had some very, very sinful things taking place. But in every single instant, they started out talking about things they were doing right. They started out commending them for the good things they were doing. And then they come back with, but there's something you're doing wrong. I have something against you. There's something that I need to present. And so it's this concept of not just immediately jumping out saying, you know what, you're doing this wrong, you're going to hell. That's going to turn people off. They're not going to listen. But when people know that we have a genuine concern for their soul, and we present them with the truth from the Word of God, that's not us condemning that action. That's God's Word condemning that action. And we present that from the standpoint that we love them, we care about them, we want them to change. And that's where this concept of gentleness applies to every Christian, but especially to those who are elders. Okay, number 12. Must not be contentious. What this means is that an elder should be opposed to fighting and quarreling. One way to understand the meaning of this word, and I think a good way to understand this, is by looking at the opposite of this word. The Greek word that is translated contentious has the meaning quarrels, disputes, and fighting. Well, remember, Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 23, and we find this same Greek term in that verse, to avoid questions which produce strife. Are there things that people in the church are always going to disagree upon that are matters of opinion? Yes. But if I know that Mike Dunn disagrees with me on a certain point, and I know he's very passionate in his view on that, and I come around and I'm constantly poking him, I'm trying to stir him up. I'm trying to get a quarrel going there. Is that going to produce any good? Is there any benefit whatsoever to arguing over a point that we are at liberty to make our own decisions upon? No. And that's really, at least in that passage, what Paul's talking about. He said, don't go in there and argue about things that don't matter. Don't keep things stirred up. One of the things that I really commend our elders for is they truly strive to maintain peace in this congregation. I commend them for that, because it is very, very easy for there to be disagreement. It is very easy for there to be hard feelings over differences of opinion. It's very easy to do that. But when we keep our focus upon the truth of the Word of God and not being dogmatic over things that are matters of opinion, that's going to go a long way toward avoiding this kind of contentious behavior. And when we think about this term contention, what this is really talking about is it's my way or the highway. And if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. And whether it's doctrine, whether it's opinion, whatever the matter is, if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong. And sadly, there have been a lot of congregations of the Lord's church that have been damaged tremendously by having men in the positions of leadership that had that mentality. That you have to accept my interpretation of matters of liberty. And if you don't follow my way, then you can hit the road. And that's not the way that it's supposed to be. Also, we read in the next verse, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24, and the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle, going back to that previous qualification, but be gentle unto all men. Now again, one of the things, and we know this from reading the Scriptures, there were many Christians in the first century, especially those who had came out of Judaism, who had some very ingrained beliefs that were not based upon doctrine. There were certain things that they were certainly at liberty to practice and engage in because they weren't matters of doctrine. But the problem arose when they started trying to force their opinions on others. Now, there's been a lot of trouble in the Lord's church for many, many, many years over these kinds of issues. For example, we look back just over the last, say, 150 years. You have things such as how many cups we should use in the Lord's Supper. Folks, that's a matter of opinion, a matter of liberty. If the congregation wants to use 1 cup, 2 cups, single cups like we use for everyone, we're at liberty because we understand that it's the contents, it's not the container. But congregations have divided because leaders in certain congregations have tried to force their personal interpretations, their personal opinions on others. You have other congregations that through the years have tried to claim that there are only certain ways that the church treasury can be used. And these are congregations that say that you cannot take money from the church treasury to support certain things. Things like children's homes, Christian colleges, that you cannot give benevolent support to those who are not members of the congregation. Now, they will say that individuals can support those things, but their opinion is that you cannot take money from the church treasury to support those things. Once again, you cannot turn to any passage of Scripture and establish a doctrinal stance on those things. Now, if a congregation believes that, wants to practice that, they're at liberty to do that. But where it becomes contentious is when the leaders of that congregation say, well, we're not going to fellowship the congregation down the road. We're going to consider them lost because they are going against our belief on this matter. It becomes contentious. There have been other issues, things such as, and really this is something that we still see raging in many congregations today. Congregations who will not support anyone that graduated from certain schools. There are a lot of congregations here in Northeast Arkansas that, take for instance, you have a preacher that graduated from Harding. Well, we're not going to accept him because we disagree with some of the things going on at Harding. You have some that are so ingrained in certain schools, especially ones affiliated like with the Memphis School of Preaching. They'll say that, if this individual is not affiliated in some way with the Memphis School of Preaching, if they didn't graduate there or support it in some way, then we're not going to endorse them because we disagree with them in this matter. Folks, these are matters of opinion. And people are turning them into contentions because they're turning opinion into doctrine. And we have to be very, very careful in those areas. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going somewhat in depth in a lot of these, going back and looking at the actual meanings of these Greek terms, because the ways that some of these terms are used today are a little bit different than the ways that some of them were used in the first century. And that's why on your handout you'll see some of that information included as well. That's why it's important, especially those who are going to be the spiritual overseers of a congregation. It is so important that they keep doctrine and opinion as two separate matters. They don't need to allow it to become contentious. Any questions or comments? All right. Yeah. Talked about those, but forgot to skip forward. All right, let's look at the next one. 13. Must not be greedy. Must not be a lover of money. You know, there are some translations that have the description here, must not be greedy of filthy lucre. Literally what that means is dirty money. Ill-gotten gain. So when we think about an elder must not be greedy, the easiest way to look at that, must not be greedy for money. Must not be a lover of money. This word only occurs 2 places in the New Testament. Here and in Hebrews 13 and verse 5, where it deals with the sin of covetousness. Hebrews 13 and verse 5. And really, the definition of this term is this: an intense fondness for money, possessions, and I've cut it down just a little bit, or an attitude of miserliness. You know, we don't really use that term miser much anymore. But we think about it from the standpoint of, the old Christmas carol, Ebenezer Scrooge. He wouldn't help anybody else. He was a miser. He hoarded up all of his money. Now you stop and you think about it for just a moment. Why would that be a problem for an elder? Why would it be an issue if you had an elder that all he was concerned with was amassing money? Well, for instance, you stop and you think about this with me for just a moment. Generally, most congregations who have an eldership, the eldership is going to be the one that's going to determine how the church treasury is used. Now, in some congregations, like we have here at Pyburn Street, one of our elders is also the church treasurer. Other congregations, they'll have a deacon that's over that task or what have you. But the elders are still the ones that determine how those funds are to be used. If you have someone, especially someone who is covetousness but is unscrupulous in his pursuit of money, they could embezzle money from the church. They could take money out of the church treasury. And I know I've been giving you a lot of examples, and I don't give names, but I know of one small congregation here in Northeast Arkansas where their bank account was completely wiped out because they had a church treasurer that was taking the money and going and spending it on the things that they wanted. And by the time that it was finally discovered, and what brought it about, people had been suspecting this for a long time. They put up cameras and they caught these individuals. He would count the money and then his wife would go behind him and take it and put it in her purse. And then they were taking and before they knew it, they weren't able to pay their bills. I mean, it was a very, very bad situation. Well, you can see where, as I have here on the screen, an elder cannot have an unhealthy desire for gain. That does not mean that an elder is to go through life just with a blasé attitude about money. An elder still has to take care of his family. An elder still has to get out and work and provide for himself, provide for his family. It's still wise for them to lay up a little money if they have the ability to for a rainy day, put money in retirement, things of that nature. But if the only thing they are concerned with is amassing gain and hoarding wealth, that's a very dangerous position for any Christian to find themselves in. Because remember, Paul said that it's not money that's the root of all evil, but it's the love of money.
We're also supposed to lay our treasures up in heaven.
We are, yes, sir. That is to be what our main focus is to be. And so once we have gone out and we have earned a living or what have you, we're able to provide for our family. The most important thing after that is not how much money we have in the bank, but how much money is in the bank account in heaven.
Another thing about that, Josh, that I'm thinking about this stuff is that if Tom and I had the attitude about it, that we just want to hoard up our own money, hoard up the church's money and all that, this congregation would never do all the works that we do. I mean, and certainly not saying this for a pat on the back, but we're constantly looking for good, sound things, and we have tried to the best of our ability to make sure that we use it wisely. Because I've seen congregations squander money, then when a problem comes along, like our air conditioning system, they have to go to the bank, and then they're indebted and they're paying interest all this time. So there's kind of a trade-off, but I definitely believe and agree that elders need to set the example for
Yes.
the congregation, that we are willing to give and help anything that is scriptural, sound, or justifiable in God's sight, that we could do that help. Because, that's one of the things he talks about the man on the roadside, that many people went by and didn't help him. But we as a congregation have always tried to help that if it was a good, sound thing. Now, there's people that come here wanting money all the time and have drug problems, but, as far as trying to do good and right, I think it's essential that the elders have to have this attitude that we're not put on this earth to hoard up things.
That's right.
Nothing's wrong with having money. In fact, that can be a good thing if you use it wisely.
And that's right. And that's where I keep coming back to this unhealthy desire, right? Love of money. There are some people that, they have been blessed with careers or what have you, where they have been able to earn a good living. They have a lot of money. How are they using it? Are they using it in good ways? If so, God bless them. They're not falling prey to this. But going back to what you were mentioning, elders have to use a degree of wisdom in considering how those funds are going to be used. And like you said, I've known of some congregations where they took the mentality, well, basically at the end of the month, we need to be balanced out at zero. We need to be using everything that we have. And you make the argument, well, like you mentioned, like the air conditioners, or, we were fortunate with the roof that we had insurance, that the elders had made sure that those premiums had been paid and things like that. But so many times people make the argument, well, that's why we pay for insurance, or that. Well, you have to use that degree of wisdom, and it's like we talked about in an earlier lesson. You've got to be able to look ahead. And if you're looking down the road and you're saying, you know what, sometime in the next 20 years, we're going to have to do this and we're going to have to do that, it's important, like David was saying, go ahead and start putting money back to cover that when the time comes up. That way you don't become indebted to someone else. And so I think there's a great deal of wisdom to be considered there. But again, a lot of times, and I'm not using this talking about Pyburn Street in specific or in particular, but there's a lot of times where there may be a whole lot of money sitting there in the bank and it's there for a specific reason. People don't know about it. And so they're looking at that and they develop the mindset, well, there's a whole bunch of money there, we're hoarding up money. And so that's one of those situations. And I know that if it was a situation where someone was feeling that way and you went and talked to David and Tom, they would explain to you. That's why we're doing things the way that it is. And so that's why it's so important. And I keep going back to this. Our elders have to be approachable. People that we're not afraid to go to with any concerns or any questions, what have you. And an elder needs to be someone that's always willing and open to fielding any of those kinds of questions that may arise. But going back to this point here, this concept of miserliness. If you have an elder who is stingy with his own money, he's going to be stingy with the Lord's money generally. And so you have someone that, they're not setting an example of being a generous giver. They're not being benevolent. They're not contributing the way they should. They're not helping others. If they get control of the money that is in the treasury, more than likely that attitude is going to carry over to that as well. And so that's why we need to make sure that we are not appointing someone as an elder that's going to pose an obstacle to the benevolence and evangelism programs of the church. They need to be people, like David said, that's always looking for things that we can do. Looking for good works, good things that we can be involved in. And this congregation is involved in a lot of good works. There's a lot of benevolence that's being done, especially here lately. We've been talking a lot about the benevolence being done through the Compassion Closet. That has really started taking off here lately, and I'm excited about that because we're helping a lot of people in our community through that. But, we support things like Truth for Today, World Bible School. We support missionaries in different places. Great works. And I know that our elders are always open to hearing about other things, sending relief to the hurricane, things of that nature. And it's a blessing that the congregation here is able to do that. And a lot of that comes down to the wisdom of those that have managed those funds through the years. And because they haven't had this attitude of being an obstacle to these things, it's been a blessing to many through the congregation here. But also notice this, a stingy eldership will produce a stingy church who will have a stingy program of work. I can't tell you how many times, especially a couple of times that I have had to raise funds to go on mission trips. You go into a congregation, they'll have their financial statement posted, they'll have thousands of dollars in the bank, and then you will ask them to help support you on this trip, and they won't help whatsoever. And then you go and you look and you see that they're not supporting any mission work, they're not supporting any kind of benevolence. They're dead in the water, folks. They're not doing the work of the church. And so, as I said, you cannot have this attitude either of stinginess or exorbitant spending. You have to find that happy medium. You have to have that wisdom that's there. All right, let's skip ahead here. Actually, that's where I got to on putting these slides together. So these next few, we don't have a whole lot of time left tonight, but I think we have time to get through one more. I don't have any slides on this, but if you look at number 14, and this is one that really is going to go hand in hand with one of the qualifications that we see in Titus chapter 1, that in number 19, about an elder's family. We're not going to talk about an elder's children at this point. We're going to wait until we get into the Titus verse, because the Titus verse is going to go into a little bit more detail as to an elder's children. But if you look at 14, it says, an elder must manage his own house well and have his children under respectful control. What this means is that an elder must be able to manage and control his own family. Because as the verse goes on to say, if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the family of God? Now, the Greek word translated manage means to be at the head, direct, to be concerned about, and to care for. An elder rules and directs in the sense of leading and caring for the flock. Just as a husband and father lead by example in their home, by direction, by teaching, by being the head of that family, being concerned for that family, being the spiritual leader of that family. Now we find this term also used in a few other places, this term that's translated manage. Romans 12 and verse 8, we find the words, he who leads with diligence. Well, although Paul does not specifically mention elders in this passage, he's no doubt referring to those who are serving in this position. And Paul, he's discussed those who have served in the church in a variety of capacities. And then he comes to those who lead or rule in the church. Well, who are the ones that are to be the leaders of the church? It's elders. It does not apply to those in the first century, apostles. It doesn't refer to prophets. It does not refer to evangelists. It doesn't refer to deacons. It refers only to elders. And what this is showing here when it talks about he who leads with diligence, it's talking about the one who is a leader is to lead with eagerness and zeal. Well, this goes back to the qualification of having a desire to serve. They have an eagerness to serve. Then in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 12, we find Paul encouraging the church there at Thessalonica to know the ones who labor among you. Paul says that these workers are over you in the Lord. Now, who would have been the ones in the church at Thessalonica who would have been over some of their fellow Christians? The elders. The elders. He says, know the ones who labor among you. Get to know them. Let them be involved in your life. Because he says these are ones who are over you. And then 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17, Paul mentions elders specifically when he says that these elders are to rule well. It's all going back to this concept of being able to manage. And so when we think about this Greek term that we find here in these passages, it's indicating that elders have been given a degree of authority. The authority that has been given to them is a responsibility to shepherd the flock that the Holy Spirit has made them overseers of. They only have authority in the congregation that they are a member of. Our elders at Pyburn Street do not have authority in any other congregation. That authority is limited. So now, let's come back to this example of managing his family well or his house well. Whenever we stop and we think about how this would apply, does a husband have authority in his home? He's supposed to. Supposed to. He has authority as the head of that family. Does a father have authority in his home? Yes. He has authority over the children who are in that home. He has the responsibility of managing, directing, leading, guiding, and caring for his family. But something that we need to understand is this is not saying that he is to position himself as a tyrant, as a dictator. It's not saying that he is to force his rule upon everyone. No, what this is saying is that he is to lead, but not in an authoritarian way. He is to lead with gentleness, lead with kindness. You know, we're told that fathers are not to provoke their children to wrath. They are to lead in a Christian manner. But also we see in Ephesians 6 and verse 1 where we're told that children are to obey their parents in the Lord. Yes, ma'am.
My dad always used to say he leads by example. And I think that's a perfect.
Absolutely.
He was teaching not only his 5 sons, but his 2 daughters what the role is. They're our teacher.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But one last thing on this before we stop. Notice that Paul also indicates in this qualification that an elder's children are to be in subjection and respectful. Paul argues then from verse 5, if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? What this is talking about here is a man's ability to manage his family will indicate to a certain degree his ability to shepherd the flock of God. Certainly, the role of an elder is different in many ways than the role of a husband and father. But there are many similarities in those positions as well. Now, most parents will readily admit that from time to time we need the wisdom of Solomon to know how to handle our children. I started to make a comment about husbands and wives, but I'll be nice. But I think that we all would readily admit that we may not always know the right answer. We may not always know the right course to take. But we make decisions based upon the knowledge that we have of the Word of God. We consider the situation and we make a decision based upon what we feel is most appropriate. But then going back to what we've seen leading up to this, a man who is emotionally stable, who is spiritually mature, and one who is wise, he's going to be a strong leader in his home. But he's also going to be a strong leader in the church. And let me just say this. If you have a man who has no control over his family, I knew one man that I've known all of my life. I always felt like this man would make an outstanding elder just from the way that I saw him conduct himself in worship services. But he was asked one time if he would serve as an elder. And he said no, because my wife is the head of our house. And apparently from talking to him, his demeanor, his personality was one of passiveness, one of more weakness. And so he basically let his wife make all the decisions, call all the shots. And so in that regard, he did not view himself as meeting this qualification. And I really think that was probably wise on his part to take that position of not accepting the eldership because of that. Okay, we're going to stop there. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we'll pick up there in number 15 with must not be a recent convert or not a novice. Appreciate everyone's comments tonight.